No, I'm delighted to welcome to the show Stephen Finn, who is a UEFA A coach and part of the research and football group in the WIT. Stephen, thanks very much for joining me today.
Pleasure to join you in it.
So we're talking Jim McGuinness because there's been a lot of talk about Jim McGuinness over the last week or so. He is being linked with the Dundalk job, how true or otherwise those links actually are. But it has brought about this debate again that came about when Jim McGuinness got the job in the US and also when he was being linked with jobs in Ireland. Is he a spoofer who is simply getting linked with these roles because of who he is and what he's done within the GAA? Or does he actually have a good football/soccer brain and is he qualified to take on the big job? So you did something that a lot of people have not done. You watched Jim McGuinness when he was in charge of Charlotte and his Charlotte team in the US. So I suppose early findings or early context to his Charlotte Independence career. How did you find his team?
Well, the first thing to say is I can't stand the word spoofer. I think, and I'm not having to go with you for using it, but I know people use that all the time. And usually this is based on essentially results. So if you win, you're a genius. If you don't win, you're therefore inept. What people don't take into account is the context of where a person is in relation to his team, as a coach, in relation to the players that they're working with, in relation to the resources that they have available, and essentially, my view is that yes, you can't say that he was a success in Charlotte because the results are obvious. He had only one win, but when I look at the context of the whole thing, there was an awful lot of a sense of he was operating one arm tied behind his back. He arrived over there in the middle of the American winter, and pre-season started with 6 players. Dreadful weather, monsoon-like conditions. So initially, trying to establish his style of play or what he wanted to do on the Charlotte Independent squad was completely hamstrung. You know, you can't build a team around 6 players. The USL is very like the League of Ireland. Players are generally sign 1-year contracts, and the later you get appointed, the harder it is to actually get in the players that you want. And he essentially was new to the league and was relying upon the contacts he'd built up in America and the people already within the club. They didn't build a particularly strong squad relative to the challenge that they were facing. And I don't believe that they assembled the type of players that he would have wanted to work with based on everything that you said before he went in there. I heard him speak several times. I've always been fascinated by him as a coach. I think, you know, he was a fascinating player because he was so different. And then as a man, like if you read his book, you can see how he was. He overcame many personal obstacles, and he decided to go back into education later in life. And what he achieved in GA was remarkable for me. The decision to move into soccer was incredibly brave and leaves yourself open only to criticism if you fail. So he goes into Charlotte. I was interested straight away because it was so fascinating to see how he got on.
Mm.
And I just felt right from the very start, this was not going to go well. This was not going to be easy for him in any way, shape, or form. The big thing I believe is if you're going into another country, you have to really know that league intimately. If you look at Bielsa before he went and took the Leeds job, he hadn't just watched every single Leeds game. He'd watched practically every game of every other team in the championship. So he was able to straight away say, well, I know how good my squad is relevant to the opposition. I don't think Jim probably knew that simply because the players hadn't actually been signed. The 6 players that he had were actually decent enough, but were they amongst the top 2 or 3 players wise in terms of the league? I don't really think so. One guy, Alex Martinez, who had played MLS, was number 10, very talented. But, you know, but he's number 10, but Was he really a number 10? Did he do all the things that he was no Wes Houlihan. He couldn't pick a hole in the tightest defense. But he has a lovely range of passing, and he's good in one-on-one dribbles. But he's kind of like a slow winger rather than an out and out number 10. But if he came into League One, he'd be a very, very good player.
Okay.
He was their star player. But after that, most of the players that were brought in didn't really fit what Jim had spoken about before, which was the Roger Schmidt high pressing game, what he had worked with in China. He talked about the physical intensity that you would get out of players. None of that really happened because Charlotte just didn't sign that type of player.
So further context to Jim McGuinness taking over at Charlotte is that it was quite a new club. It wasn't an established American club. It was still quite young. They were still trying to figure out whether they were going to get the contract for the MLS and become an MLS franchise. And there was a lot going on in the background that probably we will find out as the club progresses and Jim McGuinness progresses. But I suppose one of the things that is always leveled at Jim is that he hasn't done his time in the background of coaching. But to me, it seems that he has, because he worked in Celtic for a number of years. And initially it wasn't as a coaching role, but eventually he did move into a coaching role for several years. Then he goes and teams up with Roger Schmidt, moves to China, takes a risk there again. And then he gets his job in a small enough American club. It's not as if he was taking over Barcelona and skipping ahead of 20,000 people. It was a small American club that he was taking over and taking a risk with. So all of that panned together. In the 14 games that he did take charge, did it seem to you like this guy had figured out his footballing ideals?
Yeah, I think he does. I think he's a very clear understanding of what he wants. I just don't believe that the players that he wanted and the style of players that he wanted were being recruited by the club. And I don't know, he wouldn't have necessarily been completely in charge of the recruitment within the club because of the structures within Charlotte. The former coach, Mike Jeffries, became the sporting director or technical director and was given the role of recruiting players, while Jim was getting on with the task of essentially getting them to play the way he wanted. But if you could imagine, from what Jim has said about his time with Roger Schmidt and his beliefs on the game, he wanted to play a high pressing game. But the forwards that they had, like his top scorer Dominic Adoro, who was a very good player, he was 33. There's a striker there, Jorge Herrera, 39, a Colombian. Now, this guy is absolutely fantastic. But a 29-year-old Jorge Herrera could have played the game the way Jim would have wanted. A 39-year-old, isn't going to be able to press to the same level for the amount of time that Jim would have wanted it. So the attacking players in particular were slightly different in their attributes to what I believe Jim would have wanted. And, a lot of the work went, and they brought in a couple of players from different areas. There was a guy called Jackson who looked very good. He was young and powerful. They got him on loan from Colorado, I think. But he got injured very, very early, and he looked like he could have been the answer to that high pressing game. They signed a young guy called Zane Jones from Schalke, very, very fast, but very inconsistent. He was only 18. I think maybe, underage players can be very impressive within their setting, but when you put them into the adult game, they can really just not perform. And it's not because they're not good enough, it's just because the adjustment to adult football is so big, it takes time. So those players, that never really hit the level that Jim would have wanted, in my view. The midfield had nice ball players, but again, were they guys who really pushed, with that intensity in midfield to win the ball back high? I don't really think so. So on that basis, I just don't think he necessarily ended up working with the type of players he wanted to really impose his preferred style of play. So I suppose as a manager, if you have an out-and-out philosophy and you're saying, that's the way I want to play no matter what happens, but you don't have the players who fit that philosophy, well, if you try and impose that on them and they can't do it, you're not going
Mhm.
to succeed. So you have to then try and adapt. And that's what I think he did. He changed formations quite a bit. They started off with 4-4-1-1, and he tried three at the back once or twice. And sometimes I couldn't really get, when I looked at all the games, I couldn't really get what was the full aim of some of the changes. But this is where you don't really know what's going on in the background. You don't know who's picked up a knock, or who's had an illness, or all that interpersonal stuff as well that could be going on in the background that you're not 100% sure around the decision making. But the same 11 was very, very rarely used. So you couldn't say that he imposed his philosophy on the group. In actuality, I think he was trying to work out a philosophy that would have suited what he ended up working with. So
Yeah.
that made it very difficult for him to succeed.
And I actually watched a couple of the games myself. One of the things that surprised me, I suppose it's just because of who he is, and maybe almost placing the ideals that he had within GAA onto a football pitch. And I was surprised by the defensive qualities of the team. They were quite weak
Yeah.
defensively, and especially from set pieces, especially from, I suppose, the controllables in which Jim was so aware of and so brilliant at doing within GAA. Anything that he could control, they were all over. But in with Charlotte, it just didn't seem that they had that.
Yeah, like some of the stuff that was just mind-boggling was the goals that they conceded from wide areas. Like, it was remarkable, whether it was free kicks, corners, or crosses. Every week you would feel that they were going to concede a goal from a wide area. They had three very tall and strong centre backs who were fine dealing with balls straight on top of them, which they had to win one-on-one headers. But once the ball went wide, I don't really feel that they ever cracked being well organised defending the ball from wide areas. One of the goals they conceded against Atlanta's second team was scored by John Gallagher, who's from Dundalk and had a loan spell at Aberdeen. He's a very, very good player, but he's 5'9". He managed to get between the two centre backs and got his head on a cross. And the two centre backs were like 6'3". Actually, I think he got the head on it and it hit the crossbar, and it was bundled into the net. But it was patently obvious that, a little guy is managing to beat these giants in the air. Also, some of the goals were like comedy gold, players running into each other, which showed a sense of panic that I was kind of surprised with. But again, a coach gets, penalised by the result, but sometimes it's an individual error which costs the whole team. And sometimes that individual error can be from a referee, like in his very last game against Swope Park Rangers. Abdoulaye Mansai scored an absolutely fantastic free kick, but because Jorge Herrera was standing behind the wall, not in the line of sight of the goalkeeper, by the way, the referee decided to disallow the goal. And, when you look at the sliding doors moments, I remember when the final whistle blew in that game thinking, that could be the last match. But if they had won, would it have been the last match? Would it have bought him another week? Would it have bought him another 2 weeks? Would it have bought him the opportunity to bring in the next player or whatever that he wanted? So the defending from wide areas was very, very disappointing. One area where I did think they must get credit for, the defender Andrew Gutman, who's a really exciting left wing back who went from America to Celtic, but then was loaned back to Charlotte. Very, very good going forward, but was, in my view, very naive and erratic defensively initially. But after several weeks, you could see that he had got much better defensively. So on a one-on-one basis, I think Jim must take a lot of credit for the work that he did with him, and he ended up getting called to the US senior international squad while still at Charlotte. So obviously other people were noticing that individual work had improved. The goalkeepers was another issue too. Brandon Miller, who was the regular keeper, would be hot and cold. When he's hot, he's very hot. But like some of the goals, particularly some of the early goals that he conceded, it was almost like diving with his hands not fully extended. And, you'd be really frustrated as a manager that he didn't look like he was ready for the shot. Then he brought in Curtis Anderson, who was a young goalkeeper at Man City, who had won the World Under-17 Cup with England, and certainly had a degree of potential. But again, you throw a young guy in, Shay Given, Gavin Bazunu, teenagers as goalkeepers excel. Iker Casillas, the same thing. Historically, Donnarumma, some teenage goalkeepers have no problem because of their personality and their attributes. Curtis Anderson, to me, again, some great saves, but in terms of that, managing his defence, communicating with people, organising things, I think he was a little bit of inexperience, and that probably meant that the team never was 100% sure of the relationship between the goalkeeper and the defence.
Yeah. I suppose one of the key reasons that we're talking about Jim McGuinness here is because of who he is and what he's trying to do. And that's essentially switch codes from GAA to soccer and become in his head, and definitely in some of the things that he said, he wants to become a top level football coach. That's what he wants to do. And there are examples of people who have not coached or not played at a high level, but gone into football and done quite well. Maurizio Sarri is an example of that. I mean, Jose Mourinho is an example of that. I don't think we're talking about Jim McGuinness in the light that he's gonna do that. But
well,
do you think he has the potential to even just manage a top level club, be that League of Ireland or low England league, or even do you think he could go further than that from what you've seen?
Well, I think he can be a very good coach. I find him a fascinating individual. Anytime I've seen him talk, anytime I've heard him talk, whenever I've spoken to him myself, he oozes leadership personality. And he has put a lot of work in. I'm currently working on a book on literally those type of people, the coaches who have reached a high level without having a famous playing background. And, Brendan Rodgers is an example. If you look at Brendan Rodgers didn't even play a game of organised football until he was 13 or 14 because of where he grew up. And, because he was obviously a talented young player, he got signed by Reading, played for Northern Ireland underage, but then through a combination of injury and maybe a few other things, decided to go into coaching at a very young age. The problem, and he served his time and developed as a coach in the background without the world watching him. And it's the same with Julian Nagelsmann or Andre Villas-Boas or any of these coaches who've gone on without having a playing background. Jim's problem was that his playing background as in another sport was so high profile. In essence, very few people have tried to do what he's done, certainly to the level that he has. Clive Woodward made the jump from football to soccer, but never managed a team or picked an 11, or he went into more. His relationship with Southampton was probably more aligned to the type of sporting directors that we see now. And if Clyde Woodward decided to become a sporting director of a football club now, I don't think it would have even caused half this amount of surprise that it did back then. Mm-hmm. But Jim was a fantastic GAA player and then became a fantastic GAA coach. So I think there's some people who want him to fail. But in my view, he certainly has more than enough attributes to be successful, but it has to be in the right setting. So if we look at Stephen Kenny is to me the two most interesting Irish coaches, as in Irish sports coaches over the last 20 years, are Jim McGuinness and Stephen Kenny. And Stephen was a very, very good soccer player, but only played 4 League of Ireland games. And then he went to Brendan Rodgers route through Talatown, through St. Pat's under-19s, through Longford Town, Bohemians, and worked his way up to top, and now he's the Ireland manager. But he hasn't had he wasn't one of Ireland's greatest rugby players or one of Ireland's top hockey players or whatever. Jim has kind of got to separate people's perception of him in one sport to just go and do what he wants in the sport that he's chosen. And he's done the hard yards. He went all the way back to Kickstart 1 and the FAI courses. People were sitting in there and, people who are probably in charge of their 6-year-old child's introduction to the game, sitting next to a fella who's, you know, managed in front of 80,000 people. You know, that shows great humility. And he went into Celtic, and, you know, let's be honest, soccer is very ruthless. So the pros would have been quick to, you know, stamp all over him if they sensed any sense of weakness. So he went in there, had to be humble, had to learn, had to watch from the likes of Rodgers, the likes of John Kennedy, and the other coaches that Celtic had over the years that he was there. And then, you know, he went, put himself out of the comfort zone, went to China, gone to America. Like, if you think about the personal sacrifices you would make to do that with a young family, to uproot your whole family. You know, they moved to Scotland, then he's gone to China, then they come back, then he's gone to America. I think they went to America with him. Like, huge amount of sacrifices to pursue something. So he's not doing it to satisfy his ego. He's doing it because he wants to be good. And I honestly believe that in the right environment, he would be good. And when I make the comparison to Stephen Kenny, when he walked in the door at Dundalk, he had Chris Shields and John Mountney and no other players. But what he had was an intimate knowledge of the League of Ireland, and he knew who he wanted to bring into Dundalk, and he knew that he'd seen enough of the personalities to know that they would be the right kind of people to work with. So the likes of Dane Massey or Stephen O'Donnell, and the other players, Patrick Hubin, they all were the right fit for the right system, for the right manager, and the personality traits. Jim needs that. Jim will be better off, in my view, being appointed as a manager of someone next season. So, you know, if somebody, if a club anywhere said, right, when we kick off our first game of next season in March, whether it's the League of Ireland or another summer league, Scandinavia, America, wherever, go and do what you want. Get the guys that you want. I feel that wherever he would go, he would certainly be much more successful than Charlotte was. And then we'll have an understanding of the next level of being a manager, which is essentially you prepare for the game, you have your tactics, you have the players really well drilled, you have everything set up, and then the opposition does something unexpected, or you're up against a tactical genius. Like some in Italy, you know, the managers there are used to changing formations 2 or 3 times in the game, and the players are used to that. So, like, if Jim came up against a wily Italian coach, then we'd find out, well, has he got the capacity to react during the course of a game to make the right changes? We know that he has that in GAA, but that's the game that he's played his whole life and he's managed intimately. The question is, when the challenge gets to that level, can he do it in soccer? I think when it arrives, he will be, but I don't think he's at that moment exactly yet.
Okay. Yeah, I think everybody would like to see him get a crack at a job for more than a year to see how he gets on, because let's face it, like, he's box office, essentially. That's what he is. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens with his career in football going down the line. Stephen Finn, thanks very much for joining me today.
No problem, Andy.